everyone. Welcome to The Download, where we bring you discussion and analysis from a Catholic perspective. Today's January 27th, 2024. I'm Bradley Eli, with my two co-hosts, Rodney Pelletier and Kyle Copey. Obviously, a major part of the culture wars these days is the issue of gender. Confusion reigns supreme about what the difference is between a man and a woman. Leftists seem to think that equality between the sexes means murdering babies and embracing transgenderism. Speaking of which, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have begun campaigning on the abortion issue. All this week, the pair did a media blitz, kicking off a month-long tour under the slogan, quote, "Fight for reproductive freedoms," end quote. It began with Harris speaking at an event in Wisconsin on Monday. But before Harris took the stage at that event, you'll never guess who was one of the other speakers. It was none other than Richard, or shall we say Rachel Levine, now goes by Rachel. He is the Assistant Secretary of Health for the Department of Health and Human Services. Here's a little sample of what he had to say.
I was here exactly 1 year ago on the last anniversary of the Roe versus Wade decision, which recognized women's constitutional right to make their own health care decisions without political interference. Since Roe was overturned, we have seen the chaos and the confusion that women and their families have had to deal with related to their own health care choices in this state of Wisconsin. I want you to know that the Department of Health and Human Services is doing everything in its power to protect access to reproductive health care.
Well, I'd have to give the left some credit. It's a winning strategy, talking about fight for reproductive freedom. It's either that or you're going to talk about, what, the economy? No. How about crime? No. National security? Well, everybody and their dog is starting to nuke us right now. So you don't really have too many talking points about there. And you know what? If you're talking about abortion, fight for freedom, and however you want to recap, put that together in people's minds, at least you're not talking about how bad the Dems suck on every single other issue, such as border security. You got 26 states going against the federal government right now on the border. I think it's almost called a civil war. 26 governors against the president on something such as this massive open border policy. So, I think just stick with abortion and the fight for reproductive freedom. You're doing all right there.
Yeah, and the fact that they're sloganeering it as freedom and all this other stuff, it's like you said, it's effective because what we've seen in a lot of states where abortion was legalized after Roe v. Wade was taken down, the referendums, in every state where it's been legalized, the Democrats have campaigned at college campuses. So they're going after the young vote. Notice they keep saying they want to bring the voting age lower and lower and lower. So because they know they can instrumentalize young, impressionable minds. And I don't know if you've been to any abortion mills, you've done protesting, there's counter protests there. You talk to people who are, pro-abortion, pro-baby murder. There's not a lot of reasoning that goes on in their process for this. What a lot of young people have learned is, rather than learning doctrines from priests in the church where they should be getting their doctrines, these Marxist slogans have become their doctrines.
Yeah, and just the basic, and that doesn't even have to be religious doctrine.
Yeah.
It could be just basic critical thinking skills that we used to get when we used to have a more classical education type model. You get the grammar, the logic, and the rhetoric going, indoctrinating kids, if you will, at a very young age, just teaching them how to think better, and they're just, not getting it. And then we get, yahoos like Richard, Rachel, whatever his name is, Levine, who worked their way up into the federal government and become, top, he's the assistant secretary of HHS, and they always parade him around when there's some leftist issue that comes out. This is, leftist wordplay. What do they call it, this event? The fight for reproductive freedom. Really, the freedom to murder your children, as we alluded to. I mean, they might as well just call it the leftist version of MAGA, make abortion great again type of thing. That's what they should put on their hats. So they parade Levine out there, and sometimes he's got his he's like a dude in a dress, right? That's who they put this guy up there. But he was, I noticed he was wearing pants for that speech, so he went the transgender on us. And he starts off with saying this is a fight for women's rights and all this stuff, and then he proceeds to talk about like this bogus claim that they keep touting over and over again that abortion, or the so-called right to abortion, is somehow in the Constitution, which we have the Dobbs decision tell us no, that's not the case. It has nothing to do with due process and the right to liberty and life and all that stuff, which they've been arguing that for decades, the left has. But the left also, Levine, is still touting that claim that it's in the Constitution. And then he ends up saying stuff about, we also want to help women have their sort of health autonomy and make their decisions when it comes to their health, especially their reproductive health. But where is the left when that comes to the decision of certain shots that they want to make us put in our arms for a disease that's is not as bad as they're trying to tell us?
My choice doesn't apply on those type of things.
No.
They have a ready audience out there. Alarming statistics coming out this week. 30% of the Gen Z crowd actually identifies as LGBTQ. Those are 30% of the adults. So it goes, the slope starts there basically for that crowd. When you have 30% of your voting block there, adults who are voting, who are gender confused or have a complete a spin on morality that's not Christian morality, you don't need to talk to people about reasoning, and it's not even effective. The young people today, and I've said this before, they follow passion, their emotions, and not the reasoning, because as Kyle was saying, you don't have reasoning skills inculcated. They come from broken homes, dad's not around, the teachers, like you're saying, the leftists are indoctrinating them in school, they're not teaching them how to think. And that's the flip side there. That is the solution, is education, and it's education of the young. But see, they knew that early on. That's where the system, they got control of those education systems all the way up through the higher education. You can chart as farther up someone goes in the education system today, you are actually more likely to fall away from the faith and lose your faith and everything else. So it's, and then the other alarming statistic today, 28% of the overall U.S. population is in the group of the nuns. And that is a term that means no religious affiliation whatsoever. So you're not talking about a group that's acclimated to the Ten Commandments and the Beatitudes and thou shalt not this or that. They're just growing up watching TikTok and all of this. So trying to reach the crowd, all you need to do is just talk about fight for reproductive freedoms. Anytime you say fight for freedoms, that's a winning strategy right there.
Yeah, and it's the illusion. It's slightly amusing to me that they have a man in a dress up there, in pants, but normally in his pantsuit dress thing.
It's below the knee though.
It's modest. Saying, "Oh, women's rights." It's like, well, you're masquerading, you're pretending, you're denigrating femininity. And you're advocating for transgender policies that force this weird, men being able to go into the women's bathroom, this weird sexual fetish, allowing it to fester in Target and all these other places where, in more civil times, that wouldn't have stood at all. But here we are. We got these. We're in the crazy days now, unfortunately.
And what should really anger us is not just that the left is supporting it, because obviously they are going to support it, but the people on the so-called people on the right that are supporting this as well. You think of all the Republicans that are voting for this stuff and celebrating this stuff. I mean, they're few and far between, but they are out there, unfortunately. A lot of times when you look at those so-called conservatives who are against actually the pro-life movement, a lot of it breaks down by religion. The more religious on either side of the aisle you are. Obviously we have small amount of Democrats who are pro-life, but they tend to be the more religious ones. Obviously obviously the right is more religious in general, and the more religious you are on the right, the more apt you are to support the pro-life movement. But the Republicans who are supporting the pro-death movement are actually, I mean, they're going against what is currently written, and I hope it stays there, in the Republican Party platform. What does it say? It says that the right to life should be enshrined and not infringed upon. I mean, they're betraying their own party's platform, right. Many of these people, and they sometimes they give some like tacit support of the pro-life movement, some squishy support of it. They say things like, oh, well, it's okay as long as it's not my tax-paying dollars funding abortion, or they're asked about it by a reporter, what should happen, before the Dobbs decision, and they said, oh, this should be a states' right issue. We should kick it back to the states. And what happened with Dobbs is that, well, that's a good thing that happens, a step in the right direction, but Dobbs didn't come out and say abortion is murder, and a lot of these politicians don't want to go that far as well.
Right. Yeah.
The other winning strategy for these guys is the bigotry. You want to say it's identity politics, basically. So you have oppression by sex, race, and sexuality. Mm-hmm. So you're taking the white conservative Christian male, and he's enemy number one. So that's going to be the. It's working. It's communist, divide and conquer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's working for sure. And turning to Ohio, state lawmakers have voted to override the governor's veto and pass a bill protecting young people from the dangers of transgenderism. State senators on Wednesday voted to override a governor's veto and approved a bill that will ban transgender surgeries and hormones and ban athletes from competing as the opposite sex. The state house did a similar vote earlier this month. Both houses got the 3/5 majority needed to overcome the bill. Now, the bill will automatically become law in about 3 months. Conservatives are upset that Republican Governor Mike DeWine, who's Catholic, vetoed the bill in December. At a presser last month, DeWine recalled meeting with parents of sexually confused children, and those parents claim hormones and surgery saved their kids' lives. Apparently, DeWine brought that narrative. He bought it hook, line, and sinker. And here we go again with the language, the rhetoric. We need to save lives, because if we don't cave into this, then these people are going to kill themselves. They're going to be in trouble.
The thing is, you got to follow the science on this. That's a great phrase, follow the science.
They keep saying that, but they don't.
But they don't. They'll keep saying follow the science and everything, and then the science doesn't back them up, and then they just forget the science. But the science on this, actually, statistics show that the people who are gender confused, who are misdiagnosed, because we have to at least admit that 60 to 70% of these people, it's according to Walt Heyer from his site, Trans Regret, and he's got all the statistics from all these different studies and everything.
He's a man who thought he was a woman for a while. He had all the stuff, and then he came back.
And he went under the knife and all sorts of things. He's written briefs for the Supreme Court and everything. He has quite a website about this. Very much his head in the game. 60 to 70%, Walt Heyer says, are having comorbidities, which means that you have depression, you're suicidal, fine. That's a symptom of something.
Right.
Now, what is that a symptom of? And you might say, well, I'm confused about trans and this and that, but you got a broken home, you've been abused, you had all sorts of different clinically solvable, clinically identifiable comorbidities that they would treat you as. But they take the first thing, well, I want to change my sex, and they'll just right off the bat without going to any of those other comorbidities. So now the person grows up, and we're seeing this more and more, even Fox News and other places are talking about the regret of this. The kids are coming out at 19, 20. They've had parts of them cut off. They've been chemically castrated. They're like sterilized because of all the hormones they've had when they were 13, 14, 15. And the kids, rightly so, are saying, where were my parents?
Yeah.
Where were the priests and religious and bishops and all this? Where were the politicians and governors? Where were the clinical people that knew about this stuff? And we've had some liberal clinical people coming out and say, I can't do this anymore.
Yep.
I can't allow these people. It's basically your kids coming to you and saying, I want to kill myself. You're loading a gun and saying, here you go.
Yeah.
I just want you to be happy, pull the trigger. And it's a horrendous thing going on today. And these kids are rightly so coming back. But the other great statistic out there, the huge statistic on Follow the Science, is the fact that says if you allow this kid to be misdiagnosed, girl or boy, and they go through the chemical castration or, God forbid, the surgery, they're going to have 50% chance likelihood of being suicidal. They're going to have dropout rates through the roof. They're going to have chemical dependencies, drug addictions, go on to abuse people in and out of, crime, all sorts of these massive statistics that they're completely ignoring. One kid's saying, I will kill myself, but he's so messed up from so many comorbidities that you're not treating him. Yeah, he will, but don't blame transgender on that. Once you go through and with the whole transgender hormonal or knife, surgery with it, you're sealing that kid's fate. Almost, well over half of those people are going to go on to have horrendous lives in some way, shape, or fashion.
So this is why DeWine's call for "I did this because I wanted to protect human life" makes absolutely no sense, because the stats don't bear it out in terms of, like I said, chemical dependency, the rate of suicide amongst these people who want to detransition, who are upset with their transition. I mean, the data's out there. I don't know why he didn't consult it. Who does he consult? Well, he consults these children's hospitals in Ohio, who have a vested interest in from pharmaceutical companies, because they get a lot of money for these hormonal treatments, and they have a financial incentive to push this on kids. And DeWine also said in that presser where he announced that he was going to veto this thing, he said, I don't want to do this whole thing where it's like parents versus doctors and health decisions. I don't want the government coming in and these doctors coming in and telling the parents what to do. The parents should decide, because the parents are the closest to the situation. They know and love their child the best. And there's an element of subsidiary in that. But if you have abusive parents, you want the doctors to make the right decision and say, no, this is not a physical issue. This is actually a mental illness issue. And they're thinking that, okay, they think that some kind of mental illness is automatically going to be life-threatening. Like if you have, and I get it, people are very depressed, and that often leads to suicide, but it doesn't often have to be the case, because you can treat mental illness, and that's not what they're doing
But
here.
they're not diagnosing the mental illness. They just gloss over that, and they go right for the trans solution. And like you were talking about the dollars there, not just for the chemical treatments, but Walt Heyer was talking about it's a massive money-making endeavor, because of the tens and tens and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars that you have in the surgery and the follow-up surgeries, and then the chemicals with all that. So you're talking massive amount of money every time you get another kid down that conveyor belt to start that surgery process. You've made a lot of money for the whatever institution is going on about that.
Yeah, and Planned Parenthood has been getting in on the whole transgender thing too. They have been for a few years now supplying hormone treatments to people. So not only, do you go there for contraception, for, whatever, abortions and everything, but now, I don't know what this has to do with Planned Parenthood, literally, but they're helping to provide hormone treatments for people, which is insane. And it shows how abortion is a massive industry, and it's showing that this, like you were saying, this transgender thing is becoming a big thing. I think it was at Johns Hopkins University hospital was pushing that, even like before it was legal. They've been doing operations on kids, like sex change operations on kids. And
I think John Hopkins is like straight arrow.
You would think so, but they've been pushing this. It's kind of like Catholic hospitals doing abortions. They've kind of been doing it also. But if you have any wonder as to what happens with these operations, there's YouTube videos with animations of how these operations work. They're horrific. It's you can't look at that and say, oh, that's medical treatment. It's mutilation. It's genital mutilation. It's horrific. It's disgusting. Any thinking person would look at that and be immediately revolted by that whole thing.
That's the thing. DeWine is Catholic, and you would think that he would have some semblance of common sense from there. When the bill wasn't just about putting a minor, 13, 14, 15-year-old under the knife, but or giving them chemicals that are going to say you're never going to have kids either way, but also males against female competition.
Yeah.
Do you really need to be a common sense, how much common sense does it take to say Bubba shouldn't be going against, Betty in this, wrestling match or whatever?
Right.
And it's a bridge too far even for many liberals today. They're actually saying, no, this is ridiculous. We can't be doing this type of thing. And in a way, it is a bridge too far for many. It's causing a lot of people to refigure the whole trans thing. But it started back, I had a good friend in this whole psychology world, and he had his doctorate held up because he wanted to say that males and females in the 70s and 80s, there was actually a difference. Oh, he said it was taboo. You couldn't bring up the fact that
in the 70s you couldn't say that?
In the 80s, in early 90s, he was just starting to, he was saying you can just almost start to hint at maybe there's a difference between boys and girls.
Wow.
And that was in the scientific world. I mean, talk about follow the science. They just canned all the science.
Yeah.
Well, I know the difference. It's right here behind us. It's boys like blue and girls like pink. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just
this was our diversity, equity, inclusion officer got on the set here today and had a hand in designing the shot here. So that's what happened. That's where their CM's at right now.
It's interesting with DeWine's decision because, I mean, it was touted that he came to it. One of the reasons that led him to veto it was meeting with parents of kids, the parents have claimed their kids, it saved their life and some. He also met, interestingly enough, I didn't know this, he also met with people on the opposite end of the spectrum, parents on the opposite end of the spectrum who had children who wanted to detransition and all the, the turmoil that went into that. So I'm really surprised that hearing those stories, especially as, a so-called Catholic man, wouldn't push him to go the opposite direction here.
Yeah, they even have it's not just a push within the country, but outside of the country. The World Health Organization wants to push, let's get a control on the opposition against abortion, which I find frightening. It's almost a conspiratorial thing, and promote the trans agenda around the globe. And the only ones I really seen pushing back on that is Africa.
Yeah.
God bless the Africans for pushing back on that type of nonsense.
It really goes to the globalists' aim to depopulation. So
and control, because you're breaking up the family, you're scrambling people's brains.
And then you're making these people dependent on drugs that they have to go to the pharmaceutical industry to get their drugs just to stay how they are.
Oh, and then the military, you're giving guns and weapons to guys who are actually transitioning, and they are all so many chemicals that their emotions are all over the place. Yeah. That's a dangerous situation.
Yeah, it's bad.
Yes, I mean, if you didn't know who the WHO was before, not Pete Townsend, the globalist overlords, the WHO. I mean, even the way they titled that declaration or that press release was they wanted to counteract conservative opposition. They were calling on nations to do this. So, if you didn't know before, we know kind of.
Well, Tedros is in the basket for communism.
Exactly. So came from a communist state, communist actor. Okay, as we've been doing recently, we'd like to ride off into the sunset, so to speak, with a conversation involving the liturgy, spirituality, and what's in store for the next few days. Tomorrow is Septuagesima Sunday for those who follow the old calendar. Septuagesima is a season of preparation leading into Lent. Also, this upcoming Friday, February 2nd, is the Feast of the Presentation, also called Candlemas, also called the Purification. It commemorates the day when Mary and Joseph took Jesus to the temple in Jerusalem 40 days after his birth. Under the old law, a woman had to stay in confinement for 40 days after giving birth. She would then go to the temple and make a sacrifice to be readmitted to temple worship. The sacrifice was typically a lamb and a young bird, or for poorer families like the Holy Family, it would be simply 2 birds. An old man named Simeon and an aging prophetess named Anna were present in the temple that day and rejoiced to see the Messiah. Now it's interesting, old Simeon in the temple, he has this great prayer that he exclaims after seeing the Christ child, and it's called the Nunc Dimittis, and we say this during the liturgy of the hours every day. Simeon says, Lord, now you can let your servant go in peace. Your word has been fulfilled, as you said. I have seen the light to the nations. And it's interesting if you look up this tradition. There's a tradition that says says that Simeon was part of the 70 scholars who translated the Old Testament into Greek, during that period.
Septuagint.
The Septuagint, yeah, that's where we get the name from, the translation of the 70. So Simeon was one of those 70 scholars who did that. And interesting thing, a tradition tells us happened to Simeon. He's translating the prophet Isaiah one day. In Isaiah chapter 7, we read that beautiful messianic prophecy of the virgin shall conceive and bear a child. So he's translating that line, and he thinks, virgin bearing a child, that doesn't make sense. So he's about to translate it as woman shall bear a child, and supposedly an angel came down and stopped his hand and said, no, leave it as virgin, and you, before you die, shortly before you die, Simeon, you're going to see this come to fruition, and that's what he saw in the temple.
Wow. Yeah, they have there was two words used for virgin in the Old Testament, and one of them in that spot there for Isaiah, and it meant radically untouched, completely untouched female, a very reserved use of the word virgin for that. So that
Similar to immaculate.
Something like that, yeah, completely immaculate. It would be close to that. We were in Mariology class, and we had the professor, Monsignor, can't say his name right now. Anyway, he had a whole track on that on that particular word in the Old Testament that they were using there. Another thing that happens at the Candlemas Day there, the February 2nd, the light coming into the temple is Christ, that light entering now into the temple, and we have candles all lit and processions and that type of thing on that day for the presentation. The second feast, as we're talking about here, is the purification of the Blessed Mother. Neither did, Jesus could be presented in the temple, but the Blessed Mother, there was no need for purification whatsoever. At the same time, there was no need to redeem, and there was no sin or anything on Jesus' part there, but neither was at the baptism of Jesus. But there was five blessings of candles that are symbolic, in the traditional rite. They're blessed before Mass. Here's two of the blessings that we go over. The second blessing says, we may be inflamed with the holy fire of thy most sweet charity and deserve to be present in the holy temple of thy glory. So it's comparing the flame of the candle to the fire of charity. But also we know the candle itself, just like at the Exultet is sung at Easter, and that candle is Christ, coming into the world, Lumen Christi. Then the third blessing, Lord Jesus Christ, true light, who enlightens every man that comes into this world. It's a reference to the opening of St. John. And it compares that light of the candle to the light of God's grace that's coming from Christ, illuminating the world. Simeon, by the way, Mary Vergretta is writing about him and says he's a priest, one of the priests in the temple, ancient or an old priest at the time, and given that revelation that Christ would be coming. So he also fulfilled that particular role as well as a priest there. And he was there when the Blessed Mother came originally as a little child, and part of that whole time, as was Anna. Anna was the instructress of the Blessed Mother when she was a little tiny child. So she was not, and you'll see some statues of that too, instructing the Blessed Mother when she's a little girl. But it was not the, so she would have been familiar with the Blessed Mother after she left the temple, and then shortly thereafter came back as a, with child there. So it wasn't someone that was unrecognized by either one of them at that time. Go ahead.
Yeah, as I say, it's a beautiful bridge between the Old and New Testament. That's the segue right there. And
yeah.
It's neat. I wonder because, all of the Old Testament, the prophets, and everybody longed to see the Redeemer. And then Simeon is the one that God chose,
That was one of the reasons why Mary Vergretta was bringing these things out, but why the virginity was not looked, as a good thing in the Old Testament. One of the very reasons was because women should be fruitful, because one day somebody's going to have the Savior of the world, the Redeemer. And so looking at being seen as a sterile person like Elizabeth, they would not look well on you for that. They think you were not blessed or something because you weren't worthy to bring forth children or something. It was looked askance at. So, but it was one of the main reasons for that was the fact of the coming of the Messiah. We're covering Mystical City of God, and here's a passage from that on presentation and February 2nd, Candlemas Day. It comes from Volume 2, The Incarnation, paragraph 601. At the moment when the priest, Simeon, mentioned the sword and the sign of contradiction. The sword shall pierce your heart. We were talking about that before the show at the Blessed Mother at the foot of the cross. We can talk about that a little bit later. Which were prophetical of the passion and death of the Lord. The child bowed his head. Little tiny child bowed his head. Thereby and by many interior acts of obedience, Jesus ratified the prophecy of the priest, accepted it as the sentence of the eternal Father pronounced by his minister, the priest, Simeon. All this the loving mother noticed and understood. Remember, it says she pondered these things in her heart. She presently began to feel the sorrow predicted by Simeon, and thus in advance was she wounded by the sword of which she had thus been warned. As in a mirror, her spirit was made to see all the mysteries included in this prophecy. How her most holy Son was to be the stone of stumbling, the perdition of the unbelievers, the salvation of the faithful, the fall of the synagogue, the establishment of the church, and it just goes on and on. All those things that she contemplated. And she just understood that is perfect mirror. She sees all that at that time, and also still feels the sorrow mingled with joy and all of that, and still saying yes, per fiat continues.
Yeah, and after Feast of Candlemas here, we have the Septuagesima, or we call the Jesima Sundays. Kyle and I did a humble show on that.
Reclaiming tradition.
Reclaiming tradition. If you haven't watched it, watch it.
Yep.
It's all Kyle. I got to give him all the credit.
I'm just on camera. Rodney's behind the scenes.
But so we don't hear. So if you go to a Novus Ordo Mass, you don't hear about the Jesima Sundays. There's Septuagesima, Sexagesima, Quinquagesima. It's kind of a countdown to the beginning of Lent.
70 days.
Right. It's not exactly 70, but they just kind of round it up to that.
Which is a wonderful thing, because you get kind of a prelude to Lent. You kind of get ready for Lent. It's a pre-Lent almost.
That's exactly the point, because we need preparation. Holy Mother Church knows that we need to prepare for these mysteries. So Lent that's 40 days. And we need, the church has learned that people need time for it. So in the follow-up after Vatican II, the Liturgical Commission, led by Bugnini and signed off by Pope Paul VI, these liturgical guys said, well, people don't understand the Jesima Sundays. It's confusing, so we're going to get rid of it.
Why not explain them in a single homily at the beginning of the 70 days?
Despite the fact that Vatican II said, you churchmen need to explain the mysteries of the liturgy to people, they completely ignored that.
That was in 62. The first document that comes out of Vatican II says, there's the problem, you need to explain all these things so people get the whole spiritual thing. And they just start hacking at the body rather than adding to the spirit.
Which is weird, because in the East, they don't call it Septuagesima, but they have a preparation. The Orthodox do, the Eastern Christians do, and it goes back to the most ancient times of the church. This goes back to the early church fathers who had this preparation for Lent. And then suddenly Bugnini and the boys are like, well, modern man doesn't understand this, it's confusing, so let's just get rid of it.
That's their bad.
That's their bad.
Yeah.
They actually wanted to get rid of Ash Wednesday too, but Paul VI, in rare form, put his foot down and said, no, you're not cutting that out.
What a tyrant.
Yeah, it's really weird. So it's not full-blown Lent, but it's a time for Catholics to start to think, okay, I need to take Lent seriously. What am I going to do? It's 3 or so weeks for you to think about how you're going to go into that desert for 40 days so that you can prepare for Easter.
Rather than spending the first 3 or 4 weeks of Lent wondering how am I going to spend my Lent.
Figuring it out, and then 2/3 of the way through, you're like, I guess I'll offer up chocolate or something, and then it's not fruitful.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we, still in the new calendar kept that time of preparation. I feel like I always need it because I go from this period of, so-called ordinary time to just smack dab Ash Wednesday. Now I got to fast, put the ashes on my head. And it's like, well, where was the lead up to this? Well, we used used to have it,
Yep.
apparently. And I think about the liturgies that we're talking about, Candlemas especially, one of my favorites. For one, because there's that candlelight procession. Some churches do it, outside of the church to back in. I also get a boatload of blessed candles.
Oh, yeah.
Also after that. But they're honestly beautiful liturgies, and that's one of the things we were talking about earlier in the show. How this, perhaps logical arguments, especially for today's culture, the Marxist indoctrinated oppression, lower versus higher type of thing. Perhaps those type of people are going to be more persuaded by beauty instead of logical arguments. I mean, logical arguments are important. We still need them because people are made for truth, and as much as they reject logic, it's still the way God made them. But beauty may be more important here. I think back to the great author Dostoevsky in his novel The Idiot. When there's a line in there, it's a pretty famous line, but it was something to the effect of when people are faced with we're faced with a population that's very irrational, what do? Well, we want to introduce beauty, but we don't want just to introduce it. We want to overwhelm them with beauty. And people see that when they go to reverent liturgies, the traditional Latin Mass, especially. They see the chant, they see the processions, all these things. And it's very beautiful and striking. And it does have, for people who see it for the first time, it does have that overwhelming quality of like, oh, this is all the stuff that, I missed out on. And if only people would see this, maybe they would be more interested in our religion.
And all that beauty was gathered up organically through salvation history. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of The Download. Now, please join us as we finish in prayer, begging Our Lady's intercession for our nation and our church. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Salve Regina,
Mater misericordiae, vita dulcedo spes nostra salve. A te clamamus, exules filii Eve. A te suspiramus, gementes et flentes, in hac lacrimarum vale. Ea ergo advocata nostra, illos tuos misericordes oculos ad nos converte. Et Iesum benedictum fructum ventris tui, nobis post hoc exilium ostende, o clemens, o pia, o dulcis Virgo Maria. Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thank you again for joining us for The Download, and a special thanks to our supporters who make videos like this possible. From all of us here at Church Militant, God bless you.